All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Monday, January 13th. Um, I got out to my car this morning, getting ready to take my daughter to daycare. And as I'm walking towards it, I'm, using the clicky button to try and get the lights to turn on and the thing to show me that it's got some life and we're getting ready to get inside, and I got nothing. Just clicking the clicker, nothing's happening. Get to the door, it's locked. Go back to the house, get the other set of keys. My key fob must be dead. This is a relatively new car. It couldn't be anything else. Using the other key, that still doesn't work. Eventually, I come to the conclusion that I have a dead battery. And well, for my first thought was, thanks, Joe Biden.
Oh, touche, Ricky. I was wondering if you want to be able to land that plane. I had no idea where we were off to there, but that was well. That and I feel like I say that too, and some people laugh and some people give me a glare. But I don't know, whatever. For better or for worse, I think that's one of the things that's gonna, it's like that. And let's go, Brandon. Some of these things, which are clearly just like products of our time, but unfortunately have kind of stuck to Biden in ways that I'm sure he would say are unfair.
Yeah, indeed. But you can't always choose how people think about you or what you associate them with. So with that,
No, that's really well said. So it's interesting. Obviously, we're coming up the last week of Biden's presidency, the last week of his half century in politics, and it's time for like legacy conversations. Everyone in the media is doing this. We're no different. You have been, I said that I wanted to do like a Biden legacy one kind of at the end of his presidency. This is we are just heading into the fifth year of our podcast, and we've been kind of the start of our podcast aligned with Biden's presidency. We've seen it from beginning to end. And so I wanted to kind of do a recap or a capstone of that. And this paired with President Carter passing away a couple of weeks ago, and he lied in state last week, and he was just buried. President Biden, was one of his eulogizers, and I think you and I have been talking about how it's been really interesting to see this kind of like reimagining of President Carter's legacy now that he's passed. And so to talk about mostly President Biden's legacy, but also how that in some ways intertwines with President Carter's legacy, we're going to be joined by Charles Sykes tonight. This Charles Sykes is an absolute legend. We'll give him a more full bio when he comes on, but he's been in political journalism since like President Biden has been in office. He's been all across the country on both coasts and in the middle, like where you're on your, I'd say maybe at least second favorite state of Wisconsin, and been a kind of across the map in terms of who he aligns himself with. And I think in some ways just a fascinating he's a wonderful person to have on for his perspective and experience and expertise. And I don't think we could get many people better to discuss the legacy of someone like Joe Biden than Charles Sykes. So thrilled that he's going to be joining us tonight.
yeah, I can't wait for this one. My father-in-law actually put me onto the podcast that he started, the Bulwark, which for folks who find themselves, conservatives who feel yeah, who don't know where they stand with the current Republican Party. It's a great listen. So really looking forward to getting into this discussion tonight.
Shout out Steve, one of our greatest supporters out there. We appreciate you, and we appreciate everyone who listens.
Yeah. All right.
All right, let's bring on Charles. All right, we're now thrilled to welcome Charles Sykes to the program. Charles is a columnist and contributor for MSNBC and The Atlantic, who is also the founder of The Bulwark. He's the author of 9 books, the most recent of which, How the Right Lost Its Mind, was released in October of 2017. He was born in Seattle, Washington, and grew up in New York and in Wisconsin. So kind of the perspectives of all across the country
Yeah.
there. You also enrolled at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So we have a little bit of overlap there. And he now lives in Wisconsin with his wife, 3 dogs. He has 3 kids and 2 grandkids. He has written for every major publication. He has been on every major television show, and now we are thrilled that he is joining us. So thank you so much, Charles.
It's good to be with you.
All right, so this is the time every 4 years or 8 years, I guess in some cases, where everyone starts to do the legacy questions, and
Yeah.
we are no different in terms of what we wanted to do with this podcast. And you wrote an article just last week about President Biden's legacy, and the title of that article, which you may or may not have had a hand in, was Biden's Tarnished Legacy. So can you just talk a little bit about the thesis of that piece?
Well, again, thanks for having me on. This whole question of legacy is very difficult, as I think we were reminded with the funeral of Jimmy Carter last week. I mean, Jimmy Carter was a one-term president, but he certainly remembered fondly, largely for his character and his post-presidency. But history is full of presidencies who were reevaluated many years after they left office. So that could happen with Joe Biden as well. But as I sat down to think about Joe Biden's presidency and where we are, I kept coming back to the prime directive of his candidacy and his presidency, the fundamental, essential job that he had to do, which was to move the country on from Trumpism and to prevent Donald Trump from returning to power. And obviously, he failed at that. And so, I walk through some of the successes that he's had. I mean, he can point to the economy. He can point to, a number of things in terms of legislation. He had quite a remarkable record with legislation, but also some significant failures and tone deafness. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the surge of migrants at the southern border that he was slow to deal with, and of course, inflation. And then I guess you get the question of presidential leadership. And I think it's impossible to talk about successful presidencies without talking about presidents who were effective communicators. Ronald Reagan was the great communicator. Barack Obama was a man of incredible eloquence. And Joe Biden, I think I had a line that I cut out myself in the editing process. Can you think of a single memorable rhetorical line from the Biden presidency? He didn't use the bully pulpit. He really, one of his, I think, central errors was to think that his election meant that we were returning to before times normalcy in politics, that he could be a kind of a behind the scenes deal maker, make bipartisan compromises to get legislation through. And he didn't feel the need to be a high profile president. So, you know, there have been other presidents who've had setbacks and failures, but they were able to capture the public's imagination with their personality and their rhetoric. Joe Biden struggled even to get their attention, and he seemed like he was always faded into the background. And I'm afraid that right now he feels like kind of a parenthesis. We can go into that more in more detail, but I think his decision to seek a second term, despite his age, was a monumental error in judgment, and I think we're going to be paying the price for that for some time.
Yeah, I think almost everyone across spectrums would agree with you on that last piece.
Oh.
And we can read. Well, I mean, President Biden might not actually. That interview he gave with the USA Today, which said that he essentially implied that he thought he could still have beaten Donald Trump. Perhaps illustrated just how out of touch he and his inner circle
Delusional.
seem to have been. But I would say let's kind of go back. You do in the article highlight his many successes, and but the Biden team will tell you, and certainly they've been kind of beating this drum over the last several weeks, in particular, the last couple of days, about all of the successes that he would enumerate, all of the economic successes. And in the lead up to this election, obviously Harris once Biden drops out, Harris has to run really on his
Yeah.
record. She certainly chose to do so in a lot of ways. But it's a record that I think Biden and Harris were pretty proud of. And yet, it never seemed like that message got through to the people. Like the tone of the country never seemed to match Biden's kind of like on paper, his accomplishments never translated into enthusiasm. In fact, the opposite happened, right? He consistently went down in approval ratings despite arguably one of the most consequential legislative terms since Johnson or Roosevelt. How do you kind of make sense of that, of like those disparate things that were happening over these past 4 years?
Well, they are disparate things, and a great deal of frustration on the part of Democrats and the White House. Particularly because you can, at the end of his term, point to the unemployment rate, look at the GDP. I think most frustrating, look at the Dow Jones average. If Donald Trump had had a Dow Jones average like that, he would not be talking about anything else. He would be talking about 401ks absolutely incessantly. So the fact that we're over 40,000 on the Dow, I mean, if somebody would have told you we'd be over 40,000 on the Dow Jones, the GDP would be growing at this rate, the unemployment rate would be at historical lows, how do you think people would be feeling about the economy? They would think, wow, that's an amazing record, especially considering where we came from. The problem was, part of it is communications, but also part of it is the lived experience. Um, of people dealing with inflation. The fact that people did focus on the inflation more than anything else. I know that the economy is stupid, and I sense I sometimes feel that the rules are changing very, very rapidly, and the political class sometimes doesn't realize that, and neither does the pundit class. We have all focused for years on the unemployment rate. But I think that we're at a state now where people look at the cost of living, and obviously he miscalculated on inflation. But is there an unfairness there? Yes. But life is unfair, and every politician has to deal with the cards that are dealt to them and the cards that they deal. And so, yes, I do know that kind of frustration. But again, this comes back to the fact that in modern politics, personality matters a lot, and he was never able to connect with the voters. The voters never gave him credit because he was never part of their lives. And their lived experience was one of great frustration about the cost of living. And I've argued both sides of this issue, that in fact it was unfair that he wasn't getting more credit. But on the other hand, when I heard Democrats and some of my colleagues poo-poo anyone who was concerned about inflation, pretend that they were somehow, uninformed yahoos, Cletus, lower, bupkis, if they actually were concerned about the cost of living. I thought that was a little bit out of touch as well.
I think kind of given where Biden came into the presidency and how his message, or maybe the message of Democrats or left-leaning people generally, felt out of step with, Americans broadly. I want to come back to sort of one of the first things you said, which was the primary charge of his presidency was to get us kind of back into a quote unquote more normal like
Right.
political atmosphere. What are some of the missteps that you think that he took? I think besides maybe trying to get out there and talk about how we need to get back, like, using the bully pulpit. Like, what are some other things that you would point to?
Well, I mean, part of the bully pulpit is providing some sort of an alternative vision to, what we had been through and what we're going to go through. And I'm not sure that he ever very, very effectively did that. Now, when I talk about normalcy, also, and there's a little bit of a contradiction I want to acknowledge here. I think that one of his big failures and the failures of Attorney General Merrick Garland was not moving more quickly to hold Donald Trump accountable. I think that one of the things that had to happen was a return to a sense of the rule of law and accountability, that no one was above the law. I lived through Watergate, and part of the catharsis of Watergate was that the people who were engaged in that were held accountable. Richard Nixon was not criminally charged, but Richard Nixon paid a price, and of course, so many members of his administration. So they turned the page. They thought that they did not need to do that on the one hand. But also, I think that there was a certain tone deafness on the part of the Biden administration and among Democratic elites about many of the cultural issues, whether you want to call it wokeism or whatever. They began to use the language and adopt the priorities of the so-called the groups, the advocacy groups that talked to themselves, that convinced themselves that they were on the forward vanguard of the arc of history, when in fact they were very were in fact becoming more and more alienated from middle America and particularly from that traditional Democratic base, the working class. And there were people out there like Rui Teixeira, who were, longtime progressive guru, who was warning the Democrats, you're losing the working class. You're not just losing the white working class, you're losing the Hispanic working class. There's an erosion among black men. It's because you're talking in such a way that you're talking past them. You don't sound like you are connecting with them. And we can get into specifics of this later. And by and large, that was ignored. And one of the things that I lived through, and I've lived through so many of these cycles now, was how, the phrase both sidesism. Well, I think we need to talk about both sidesism because, as a never Trumper, I'm aware of the bubble that was created on the right, but there's also a bubble on the left. There was an alternative information system, and they shouted down many of the voices of people saying, you're going in a direction that is alienating many of these voters. You're going to start losing elections. I mean, I remember every time I brought up the issue of Biden's age as one thing, we just got hammered on social media by what we came to call the blue MAGA, and very intensely. If you raised questions about whether or not the Democratic Party had gotten out of step with moderate, center right voters in the heartland, you just got hammered. And so there was an enforcement mechanism telling Democrats not to, in fact, change course. And I'll tell you, this is one of the problems with the Kamala Harris campaign. And as you gentlemen know, I did burn all my bridges, and I supported Kamala Harris. I actually thought I liked her. I did like her. I was surprised. I was impressed by her. I think she was a very good candidate, but she was also a prisoner of Democratic Party's internal politics. She took positions back in 2019 and 2020 that she just could not separate herself from. And the Trump campaign, I know we're getting kind of ahead of ourselves here, but the Trump campaign spent more than $100 million on one ad involving transgender issues. And it's interesting how little discussion there is even now on Democrats or my colleagues at MSNBC. Why did the Trump campaign think that they would spend $100 million on this one issue if they did not think that this had become kind of the code for the fact that the Democrats had become were out of the mainstream. And Kamala Harris was never able to respond to that. She was never able to break with her positions, in part because I think there was a fear of alienating some of the Democratic base. So to a certain extent, I think that Biden had good instincts. I think that Harris knew that she needed to tack to the center, obviously. I mean, that she would hang out with people like Liz Cheney and me, but she wasn't able to tack to the center in such a way that she broke with this very heavy baggage from her party's left wing.
So I think in Biden's desire to hew to the center and to push kind of the radicals on both sides away, you mentioned earlier that in some ways you think he's going to be like a parentheses because, and I see that too. He's really going to be defined in many ways by Trump. Like this is the Trump era that
Yes.
Biden, had maybe interrupted briefly, but this is still going to be the Trump era, certainly as like recent historians, but it seems to me like in the future, that's how it's going to be looked at. So Biden, one of the things you mentioned that Biden could have chosen to do is to aggressively prosecute President Trump and the people that were with him on January 6th and through some of these other
Yeah.
potential
Yeah.
criminal cases. One of the other things that he could also have decided to do was taken the route of another one-term president, a Gerald Ford, potentially, and pardon uh, President Trump.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately he does neither, right? He criticizes President Trump rhetorically, but doesn't necessarily go after him hard. And ultimately, nothing really happens. President Trump isn't held accountable aside from this New York charge, like criminally, and yet the voters don't reject him, or there's no kind of coming back together in a unified way. And maybe that's your point about President Biden being a little bit out of touch, having been in politics for 50 years and not realizing we were in like a different era now, that there was not going to be this kind of kumbaya coming together. But ultimately, he does neither of these things and ultimately falls apart all across the board.
Yeah, and again, I understand the mentality here of say of Merrick Garland. Sometimes we have to figure out like which movie are we in? Are we in the tragedy? Are we in the historical drama? Are we in the comedy? Are we, what is the big challenge here? Is it a tearjerker movie or is there a monster about to jump out? Merrick Garland thought that he was in the movie of the 1970s, and I apologize that I've forgotten the name of the Attorney General who came in under Ford. And the job back then was to restore the integrity of the Justice Department after Watergate. I think his name was Levy. You guys will correct me on this. And this was a very important, moment. And there were a lot of people in the legal community that I know, who I respect greatly, who thought that that was the main thing, depoliticize the Justice Department. When in fact, I think there was probably something else that he needed to do, that he needed to hold him accountable. But again, Joe Biden made the same calculation that Mitch McConnell made. Mitch McConnell was under no illusions about who Donald Trump was or what his responsibility was for January 6th. But he figured, and I think almost everybody figured in early 2021 that, okay, well, Trump was irrelevant, that Trump was dead, that Trump had taken care of himself, that there was no way that he was ever going to come back. So Mitch McConnell didn't think he needed to impeach him. He figured things would take care of himself. I think that Joe Biden and Merrick Garland might have thought the same sort of thing, and as a result, I think they misread the moment. But also, Joe Biden misread the moment in another way. You mentioned Lyndon Johnson and FDR. I don't think that when Biden first ran, he had a particularly ambitious agenda to be a transformational figure. He won very narrowly, but once he got into office, the party decided if not now, then when. All political parties overreach, all political parties misread their mandate. And so suddenly he staggers into this office and everybody says, you're going to be the next FDR. You're going to be the next LBJ. It's not just that you're going to right the ship and return us to normalcy. We have to be absolutely transformational with these massively expensive pieces of legislation. And I'm not sure that that's what the moment required back then, in retrospect.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Fintan O'Toole wrote a really interesting piece a couple of months ago, and the
Yeah.
byline on that, or the kind of the heading on that, was Biden's tragedy is that he has come to feel that he alone can rescue America. And Ricky and
Yeah.
I talked about this after the first debate, where President Biden says, like, I'm the one saving democracy for our country, and then
Yep.
President Biden, this is the most important election in the history of our country, and I'm like, this is you could have like taken those excerpts and said, who said it? And for years, you would have ascribed it to President Trump, but it's become President Biden. In Fintan O'Toole's column, he talks about this idea of Hans Christian Andersen's The Shadow, where like when you define yourself by something that you're not, that slowly overtakes you. And Biden, I think, probably recognized the moment in the sense that if the ultimate goal of his presidency was to end Trumpism,
Yeah.
that's right, but I think unfortunately he fell victim to the same kind of savior complex where he felt like he was the only one that could do it.
That's very well put, and I think that there was a certain amount of hubris, which is a nice way of saying, stubbornness, and maybe a little bit of selfishness. I mean, the fact is that when he ran. In fact, he says this in the interview with Susan Page that he never thought that he was going to, serve, into his mid 80s as president. But once he gets there, once you're the president, you've surrounded yourself with a very, very loyal staff. It starts to seem like a very, very good idea. And he did begin to think that he alone could win this election. And I have to say that, I part of me is I think angry is too strong a word, but I am annoyed, which is too weak a word, um, by the way they handled the age issue because it's very clear now that they knew, and they shielded him and they covered it up until that debate. And I was among those that raised the question. I mean, but my position was this is a real problem, but I don't know that the Democrats have a plan B. And I was reassured by his performance at the State of the Union address. But that debate was that eliminated all serious, uh, I think, question about whether or not, number one, he was, up for the campaign, much less up for another 4 years, much less whether he was up for the job as it was there right now. And the fight that took place how long did it take for him to drop out after that? It was a few weeks. It was a very long few weeks where you had, many Democrats, many loyalists who just simply refused to recognize the evidence of their own eyes. And at that point, when he was hanging on, that was stubbornness, selfishness, and arrogance. And unfortunately, that I think is going to tarnish his legacy going forward because you throw Kamala Harris in there with all that baggage, and the fact that she came as close as she did is actually pretty remarkable considering how deeply underwater he was at that point and how little time she had to put that campaign together or recover from mistakes she might have made.
Do you think had he never decided to run again, that the outcome might have been different? And I guess, obviously that sort of assumes that you have a normal democratic primary process, and obviously that's a bit different than what we ended up with. But obviously, and this is all a lot of hindsight, Monday morning
Yeah, yeah.
quarterbacking, but it feels like that the headwinds were insurmountable and that it wasn't going to be anybody from the Democratic side who was trying to, beat the drum of the economy and low unemployment and all these other things that we typically look at, that it wouldn't have mattered.
That is an excellent, excellent question, and we debated that at the time. And I think one of the reasons why the party stuck with Trump I'm sorry, stuck with Biden for so long was because there were two schools of thought. Number one was that Kamala Harris was not going to be up to it, and she would be annihilated. But also that an open primary would be disastrous because the party would tear itself apart between the centrist and the progressive wings, and we will never know. But I think your point that by that point the headwinds were so great. But then again, you just never know in politics. I mean, it's just the thing about politics is it's always contingent. And the X factor was always the character of Donald Trump. I think the Democrats counted on that too much. I counted on that too much. I thought that would override many of the negatives, but it did not. I mean, I think the Democrats really ought to ask themselves when you look at the Republican Party right now, this is not an impressive party at the moment. I mean, by any standard, the clown show of the House of Representatives, Donald Trump himself, a convicted criminal, not to mention somebody who tried to overturn the election. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and look at the people in the cabinet. I mean, these are not second-rate people. These are not third-rate people. These are people that would not be allowed in polite society a few decades ago. And yet, so that's why I turn the camera then on the Democrats and say, okay, guys, What does it say about you that you were not able to beat these chodes? What does it say about you that you're not able to beat the guys that come out every single day and set their hair on fire and get into their clown cars? So this really was an indictment of the Democrats that they have been unable since 2016 really to confront all of this. I think, by the way, parenthetically, one of the disasters here was misreading the midterm elections. Uh, had Democrats been wiped out in 2022, I think there would have been more of a reality check. I think that they would have been more willing to dump Biden, but they told themselves what they wanted to tell themselves. They told themselves that they could ride Roe, and discuss with MAGA back into the White House, and that was obviously, a tremendous miscalculation.
So I want to circle back to where we started with that legacy is a really interesting and complicated thing.
Yeah.
And Ricky and I sat here and did a podcast in 2021, and we said we had a similar view to what, President Biden probably did, what, Leader McConnell probably did. We thought Trump was done. And it's crazy how
Sure.
quickly things change. It took not even 4 years for it to completely change. And
Yeah.
we talk about President Carter, he leaves office as, some of the lowest approval numbers in presidential history at the time, and now 60 years later, he's being kind of lauded not only as this great, decent man, but also people kind of re-examining his presidency and saying maybe it wasn't quite as bad as we thought at the time. And it's impossible to know, right? Because we couldn't have predicted the perception of President Trump would change so quickly, or the way the perception of President Carter would change over the long
Right.
term. Uh, but if you could look into a crystal ball, do you have any thoughts on, what do you think history might be kinder to President Biden than the present is being?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's no question about it. Because I think that history is going to be very, very unkind to Donald Trump. Right now he is riding very, very high. He is at the peak of his power, and unfortunately, this is the story of hubris. Is that at your moment of maximum power and self-confidence is when you dare the gods. So. I do think there's that possibility. There's also the possibility. Remember, there's only been one president who served non-consecutive terms. This, by the way, is not intended as a trick question. Okay, it is not. But so there was Grover Cleveland, who was president, defeated, became president again. Who was the president between him?
I
The
know
answer is
this
Benjamin
answer.
Harris. Okay, I know. Okay, but I'm asking this because outside of nerds like us, I don't think that many people would come up with the name Benjamin Harrison. And so if you say, how does history remember Benjamin Harrison? The answer is they don't. No one remembers Benjamin Harrison. So there is that possibility. Look, we have a history full of actually successful one-term presidents or one-term presidents who are remembered very fondly. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, James Polk, all of these folks are, hold up well. But then history is also full of the people who are the parentheses. And the reality is, okay, by the way, one of my favorite lines that I used as a cable TV pundit in the fall when we were all feeling irrationally exuberant was that it will be Donald Trump's fate to be a one-term president bookended by a man named Barack Obama and a woman named Kamala Harris. Now, in fact, that's completely not true. That was completely wrong, as so many of us pundits were about that, because this is going to be remembered as the era of Trump. From 2016, 2015 to the end of his term, the books will be written, history will be the era, the age of Trump, and everything will be seen through that lens. And that, unfortunately, is Joe Biden's fate.
I wonder also, just in thinking about the process of democracy and how we judge kind of near-term winners and losers and some of the achievements that Joe Biden
Yeah.
had, sort of whether you agree with how much money we're spending, kind of notwithstanding, like a lot of the infrastructure was sorely needed, right? Some of the infrastructure spending
Oh
on
yeah.
bridges and roads and things sorely needed, but you won't really see the benefits of those until those projects are completed 5, 10 years down the line. And even then, people take that kind of stuff for granted. How well is democracy suited for somebody who's trying to make kind of structural, like long-term changes? Yeah, not necessarily like putting Biden in as the only one in this camp, but trying to think of.
Right. Well, that's another excellent question that we don't have time, and I don't mean like short time. I mean, this we could spend years discussing this. What does it take for democracy to be successful in the information ecosystem we have, in the kind of divided system that we have? What exactly do voters want? Do voters reward competence and success anymore, or has it become something completely different? You know, the world is so changed the way we interact with one another, the way we communicate with one another, just since 2015. And I think the part of the problem is a lot of our discussions, talk about politics as if it's somehow a just sort of a normal, reasonable continuation of what it used to be. But it's not. You have the destruction of the destruction of much of the media, the elimination of many of the guardrails, the way that people interact with one another in politics, our expectations about politics. I mean, I remember a conversation that I had after the shock of 2016. I think I was talking at that time on my radio show with George Will, and he and I were both saying, we thought politics was one thing and it turned out to be something completely different. We thought the conservative movement was about fiscal conservatism and about the importance of character, and it turns out that actually that was this thin crust on top of what Donald Trump, I think, probably instinctively understood was this sort of molten lava of what the conservative electorate really wanted. So in terms of to your question, um, it's in many ways it's sort of like the corporation that becomes obsessed about the quarterly earnings rather than actually accomplishing anything long term. I actually have been wondering more and more lately about whether or not our system has the will and the capacity to deal with the kinds of massive crises that we have. Um, is there any reason to believe that we're going to confront the kinds of disasters that we're seeing, say, in Los Angeles right now? Are we going to be able to confront the next pandemic? Are we going to be able to deal with the challenges of infrastructure going ahead? Um, our educational system is in crisis. Back in the before times, I used to write books about our educational system. By any metric, we have a real problem. I mean, there was a time when America would say, "Hey, Russians have Sputnik. Um, we're a nation at risk. We needed to mobilize bipartisan commitment to solving these problems." Does anybody think that we have that will or that capacity to deal with those big problems? So that's a crisis of democracy. Democracy fails when it fails to deliver. And by the way, Joe Biden understood this. The autocrats of the world, the illiberal anti-democrats, always argue that democracy might feel good, but it ultimately falls flat on its face. It doesn't accomplish anything. It's not efficient. It's not strong. And when democracy continues to fail the public, when it doesn't keep them safe, when it doesn't deal with these things, then it's in crisis. So, yeah, Joe Biden thought it was 1938 again, and you pass big infrastructure bills, and somehow that's what the demos wanted. Not anymore.
Charles, you've been more than generous with your
Hmm.
time. One final question for me, if
Sure.
you'll entertain me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on the
Yeah.
premise of this question. But your Wikipedia page says that over the course of his public life, Sykes has gone from mainstream liberal to conservative Democrat to strongly conservative Republican to libertarian, and as of 2024 is featured as a vehemently anti-Donald Trump voice on the network MSNBC. So that may or may not be
That
true.
sounds bad, doesn't it? Yeah.
But I think Ricky and I were talking about this before. I think it's really interesting, and yeah, I guess you could spin that in a negative picture, but it could also point to like real thought and evolution of like where the parties are at, where the ideology is at, and in some ways, I appreciate that. To me, speaks of someone that's being thoughtful of what they believe in and who's representing them. But I'm kind of after the election, we did a podcast and Ricky was kind of like, well, where do you go? And I'm kind of like, I don't know. There was a commentator on CNN after the election that said like the never Trump part of the Republican Party is kind of homeless right now. Like the never Trumpers don't have a
It
home
has
to
been
go
for a
to.
while.
Well, okay,
Right.
but so then where where do you go? Where do I go? Like what how obviously I can imagine you've thought a lot about this. Where do people like us, where is our home? Where we make it home?
Well, funny, I was actually taping something this afternoon on all of that. I mean, the first thing is to acknowledge, like sort of an alcoholic, that, yes, we have failed. We have failed completely. Never Trump failed to, convert the Republican Party, and then obviously failed to convince the American public this was not a good idea. So we are home. We are homeless. We are exiled. But see, this is not a new thing for me. I've been really homeless since 2016. And I have to say that as disappointing as the election is, it's also in some ways liberating. It's an opportunity to say, okay, we're not part of any tribe. We don't have to we don't have to defend shitty people. We don't have to align ourselves with shitty people. We don't have to defend the indefensible any longer. We can, in fact, sit back and ask that question. Okay, where do we go now? What do we believe? Because when you're in the heat of partisan battle, you're not an independent actor. And this is where, frankly, I've broken with some of my colleagues who basically are become, political operatives, because then you're doing talking points. You're not thinking things through. I always try to think things through. Now, the Wikipedia thing is funny, but you have to understand the length of time that when I was the liberal Democrat, I was 16 years old. Okay, 16. I was a teenager. There's a few decades have passed. And the one thing that I've always been is a little bit of a contrarian. So, my father was a liberal Democrat. He was in the Civil Liberties Union. And then when the left lost its mind in the 70s, he said, I don't want to be part of this club anymore. And so we drifted over, to the neocons or whatever it was. And, but, and yes, I did align myself with conservatives until conservatives basically said, no, we're not the kind of conservative you thought we were. I thought they were reformists. There are a lot of ex-liberals who aligned themselves, people like Bill Kristol and others. And when they became sort of this nativist thing, it's like, no, we are still small L liberals. So even though it sounds like I've been all over the place, the through line has been that I've always been skeptical of people in power and always been a believer in small L liberalism. And at one time, I thought it was the left that posed the greatest threat to small L liberalism. Now I believe, or at least in the last decade, it has been the right that has been the vector of illiberalism. And so this kind of does lead you to say, okay, I'm not part of that tribe. I'm not part of that tribe. And I am personally, as an only child, comfortable with not being part of a tribe. I must admit, maybe I find that somewhat natural, but I don't know. Now, are you guys familiar with this Principles First group, um, run by a fellow named Heath Mayo? They're having a conference next month in DC, and then they're the closest to a group of they're they're not progressive, Democrats, but they're also obviously not aligned with the Republicans anymore. And I'm going to really be interested to see what their mood is, because they are all orphans. And I think they have to realize they're going to be orphans for a very, very long time.
Well, I mean, it'll be fascinating along with the Biden legacy conversation and the Trump coming in now. It's all an interesting time to be alive. Charles, thank you so much for
It
being
is.
so generous with your time. I mentioned so you can find Charles's work MSNBC at The Atlantic. You've got your book. It's one of your latest is just one of nine. So where else, Charles, if people wanted
And,
to
and
follow
and the
along?
newsletter. And the
Yeah.
newsletter is where basically I'm going to spend most of my time on Substack, where I don't have any boss. I think that this is going to be a moment for independent journalism. So my Substack newsletter is To the Contrary, and after is To the Contrary, of course. And you can find that on Substack. It is free. I have no paywall and will never have a paywall. And then after February 9th, I will probably start doing a podcast as well, going back to podcasting.
Well, that's awesome. We'll definitely be following along. I'm not gonna lie to you.
Thank
I
you.
subscribed to the Atlantic after I saw a couple of your
Mhm.
articles, so I'll
Oh,
be reading
great.
along. I'm sure everyone will go follow them. I'll be looking at the Substack. But again, Charles, thank you so much. You've been so generous
Yes,
with your
you.
time. We appreciate it.
All right. Okay. Great questions, guys. Thank you.
All right. Well, again, huge thanks to Charles for joining us. Really, we say this all the time, Ricky, but we do feel exceptionally lucky when people like Charles are willing to come on. He's such a busy guy, and we really just scratch the surface in terms of the work he does at MSNBC and the Atlantic. And he just retired from the Bulwark last year, and like you said, he's on his Substack, and he was a radio host for years, decades, and that he was willing to hop on with us for 40 minutes was terrific. I think we knew going into the conversation that it's difficult to evaluate someone's legacy in the moment. I pointed to how legacies change not only over the course of 60 years, but over the course of sometimes 3 or 4 years. So I think he did a fair job of acknowledging that President Biden had a lot of successes in the White House and that in the long run, people will probably look back more favorably on him. His approval ratings will almost assuredly rise from the mid 30s, where it's been mired for a couple of years now, while also acknowledging that in some ways this presidency was a failure and that President Biden is going to be defined by what he kind of failed to do as opposed to what he was actually able to do. I mean, I think all of that is kind of fair.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I don't know if I ever mentioned to say this on the podcast, but I often felt out loud, and I hope at least I shared this musing with you that like President Biden had this opportunity to be this like hit pause president, right? Like you had the rhetoric was getting out of hand. You had a lot of uh yeah, the politics just no longer felt like politics. The people were just bemoaning the death of civil discourse, and here you have a relatively moderate guy, who's just like the embodiment of what we think of like the classical US president, just like this old white guy who's not very extreme in really anything that he believes. And he has this moment that he can kind of turn the temperature down and reset politics. But when he gets into power, I think Charles like rightly pointed out, all of the kind of factions within his group are like, yeah, but we have, we got Congress, we got the Senate, if by a whisker, and we're gonna do like literally everything. And it's not going to be the things that people are complaining the most about, whether or not he genuinely could have done much about things like inflation or the cost of living in a cost of housing in a very short period of time to be debated. But I think it's fair to say that by wishing that the Trump era was just over and that whatever, Merrick Garland's going to do and these random court cases are going to do are not going to come back to me, I think he missed maybe an opportunity a bit. And I think Charles was right, at least in the near term, that's what folks are going to focus on.
Yeah, Charles used the word hubris several times throughout our conversation. And again, that seems like an apt word. President Biden's been in office for 50 years at this point. Like he ran for Senate as like a 30-year-old. Like he ran for president 3 different times. Like this is not a man that lacks confidence, right? And no matter what, right? Whether he was young or we know that he suffered several terrible personal tragedies in his life, and uh, even in the 2020 primary when it seemed like he was going to be counted out after Iowa and New Hampshire, right? It's like his self-belief that propels you to this position, the highest, most powerful position in the world. But unfortunately, like, like Charles kept making references to plays, which I thought was really kind of nice and got me thinking throughout that conversation. It does feel somewhat tragic, Biden as a character. And I referenced this story by Fintan O'Toole in the New York Review. I want to read the whole passage because it's really stuck with me. He writes this after the debate between Biden and Trump, and he said, quote, "Those who define themselves by the thing they are not eventually find themselves more and more like their imagined opposite. To be someone's antithesis is also to be their alter ego. Watching the disintegration of Joe Biden in a CNN debate with Donald Trump, I was reminded of Hans Christian Andersen's chilling story, The Shadow, in which a man's shadow gradually comes to life, infiltrates his existence, takes over his entire persona, and kills him off. Biden's shadow is Trump, and we got to watch in real time as it inhabited and displaced him. He goes on to like specifically reference like that golf conversation where Biden's like, "Well, I'll take you out there and I'll beat you at golf," and then Trump's the one that actually says like, "We don't need to act like children." And O'Toole's point is kind of like Biden in some ways has become the one thing that he had railed against, and how sad that and tragic that is. And um, yeah, I do think that's true in some ways. Like if he had really been like while he never promised explicitly to be a one-term president, he did say that he was going to be a transitional president. He was going to quote like act as a bridge. And if he had come out in 2 years and tried to be that, like you said, and Charles said, we don't know how that was going to turn out, but we know what eventually happened, and that's the one thing that he really ran on not allowing to happen. And it's hard to say that he wasn't really responsible for that. So, in that sense, no, he's in the midst like many presidents do, but I think Biden's been particularly obsessed with like his place in history and legacy. Like he's constantly surrounded himself with historians at the White House and in terms of speech writing and how to deal with certain issues. And he's very much trying to define his legacy over the course of this week in many of his speeches. You can see why it would be so frustrating to a man that cares so much about his legacy to seemingly, from his perspective, be not like underappreciated and misinterpreted for like all of the good that he's done. But you can also see like the hubris that we pointed out that's not allowing to see him to see like how some of his fatal flaws really allowed this present situation to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that that is really interesting, and you can see kind of the evolution of Biden's even like debate style or speech making over the last 4 years from not really trying to focus directly on Donald Trump to like more or less being obsessed with the fact that I am here to save you from this guy, but in trying to get that message out, all I talk about is this guy. And I think, this notion a bit of like holding Trump accountable, where it gets tricky or where it gets stuck sometimes is that it doesn't focus necessarily on like what we're trying to hold Trump accountable for, but more like what we're. I used to think of like the Al Capone and the like the racket, the like tax evasion charge, right? It's like we know he did all these bad things, but some of them don't even fit in the laws, or we have no way to prove the ones that we all know are bad. But we have this thing, so we're gonna go with that. And which to me like makes me feel that way about some of these random convictions in New York. That just like what we want to convict him on is basically trying to overthrow the government and all like treason and all of these really big ideas that are bad, but we can't, so we're doing this other thing. And in doing so, we invite that avenue of discussion around this is purely politically motivated, and what Democrats and the left are upset about is what Trump represents from the nativist kind of standpoint. And when people are attacking him, they're actually attacking you. I think Trump did a really good job of kind of framing the his prosecution as a prosecution of people's beliefs. And when people feel like they're not being allowed to believe what they believe, I think you see a strong reaction against that. I also think like we talk a lot about how polling is interesting and how everyone kind of still puts the economy and inflation at the top of their list. But Charles talked really about, Republicans spent $100 million on ads about Kamala Harris in this one talk where she said she would allow prisoners to get, transgender, whatever medical treatment. And like, I think if you ask somebody what you're voting about, the answer is never going to be that. So that, convenient or more palatable answer as well. Inflation is what it is, or I can't afford my house. Who I'm choosing between and what their policies are to tackle this issue, like no one was ever talking about, but we allowed kind of the narrative to be like, oh, we're still voting on the economy, even though I don't know. I think that that's going to be tricky. I'm obviously meandering from kind of the topic at hand, but I feel like it is like this, like the short term and long term, and how people view these things, and how people make decisions and voting decisions is that like marriage of all these types of different considerations.
Yeah, and every time we have an end of a presidency, particularly in a case like Biden, where we know like this is kind of really the end of a half century long political career, it's it's pause for thought. I think it's almost too on the nose that President Carter passed last week and that President Biden eulogized him, because it felt like in some ways the things that Biden was saying about Carter, like he like wants people to think about himself too, and he ends his eulogy with keeping the faith with the best of humankind and the best of America is the story, in my view, of Jimmy Carter's life. And I think President Biden would want people to say the same thing about him. The difference is that President Biden's not going to have, barring some modern medicinal miracle, like 45 years post presidency to kind of expand on his legacy as a person. And I'm sure, I mean, he obviously knows that too. But it just felt, he's eulogizing Carter, which in some ways was his contemporary for a little bit of time there, of this like bygone era of American politics and American life. Um, and it's something we can all appreciate, but is also in some ways, not really made for this world. And I think you can, it's fair to lament that, but it's also fair to say that it's a style, that's character, personality that's no longer in vogue.
Yeah. No, you're usually the one that does the Dark Knight quotes, but I thought a lot about the like you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. Like where he kind of exited as VP for Obama, he was really like riding. I think people were thinking very highly of him in that role. But yeah, if you're around long enough, folks will kind of ascribe all the bad things to you. But I think, yeah, as you said, legacy is complicated, and maybe it'll take another 30 years before people can look back on this.
Yeah, I mean, I can hold out hope that you and I, perhaps not still doing this, but at least having these same conversations. So maybe we'll go back and revisit this in a couple decades. Knock on wood that we're both still going there, Ricky. But that's all I got for today.
I suppose we can leave it there. Till next time, buddy.
I'll see you.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though we did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.